Hello everybody, and welcome to Sociolinguistic Variation in Metaphor Comprehension, an experimental study by myself, David Gil, and my colleague, Yeshayahu Shen. This talk brings together two quite different strands of research. One of them is linguistic typology, focusing in particular on social-political typology. The other is metaphor theory, focusing on a pervasive property of metaphors, namely their directionality. And what this paper does is to bring together these two very different research agendas within the context of Austronesian and Papuan languages. In linguistic typology, we have various strategies for constructing our samples. We can go for geographical variation, looking at languages from different parts of the world. We can go for genealogical variation, studying languages belonging to different families. We can look at structural variation, focusing on languages of different grammatical types, such as, for example, SOV versus SVO. Or, which is what we do in this paper, we can focus on socio-political variation and distinctions such as those between small and large languages. In order to obtain data on socio-political factors, we make use of the dplace database, which is a large-scale, in-progress, freely accessible database housed and developed by my home institution, the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. In particular, we'll be looking at the feature characterized as jurisdictional hierarchy beyond the local community, which measures the number of hierarchic levels characteristic of the polity in question. Making use of the dplace database, we posit a scale of polity complexity, which is of a hybrid nature. The primary distinction that it makes is between national languages and regional languages. And within regional languages, it further distinguishes between languages of different jurisdictional hierarchies in accordance with the feature that we saw earlier. In this paper, we'll be looking at results from several languages, including 4 that fall within the remit of the APLL conference, 3 Austronesian languages, varieties of Malaic, a 4th language, Abui, belonging to the Timor-Alor-Panta family that is spoken in East Indonesia on the island of Alor. And as you can see, these languages give us a nice spread across the polity complexity scale: Standard Indonesian as a primary national language, Jakarta Indonesian as a colloquial variety of a national language, Minangkabau and Abui as regional languages, but of different levels of jurisdictional hierarchic complexity. Now, why should we be interested in polity complexity? The answer lies in the complexity covariance hypothesis, which I have argued for in the 2021 reference below. The basic claim here is that linguistic complexity co-varies with cultural and socio-political complexity, or in other words, the more complex the polity, the more complex the language, and in particular, its grammar is. We turn now to the second major strand of this talk, namely metaphor directionality. Metaphor directionality is a pervasive feature of metaphors that has been discussed at length by numerous scholars, both in linguistics and in cognitive science. Here are 2 pictures that look alike. There's a baby, there's a dog, and they're both exhibiting remarkably similar postures. This was actually a meme that circulated on the internet several years ago. Now, mathematicians and logicians tell us that similarity is a symmetric relationship. if A is similar to B, then B is also similar to A. However, language doesn't work that way. Metaphors don't work that way. Which of the two would you prefer? The baby is like the dog, or the dog is like the baby? Well, both are grammatical sentences. However, there is massive empirical support, both experimental and from corpus studies, that show us that we prefer to say that the baby is like the dog. It sounds better than its alternative, the dog is like the baby. And there's a good explanation for this. The explanation is in terms of the animacy hierarchy. In general, we prefer to explicate entities higher on the animacy hierarchy in terms of entities that are lower on the hierarchy. So in this case, the baby is human, the dog is an animal, humans are higher than animals on the animacy hierarchy, and therefore we prefer to say that the baby is like the dog, as opposed to the dog is like the baby. And in metaphor studies, we use the terms target to describe the notion that is being explicated, source to describe the notion that is doing the explicating. So animacy is an important conceptual hierarchy that underlies metaphor directionality. However, it's not the only one. There are two other important hierarchies governing metaphor directionality. One of them is abstractness. So we prefer to explicate abstract notions in terms of concrete ones. So we'd rather say that anger is like a volcano rather than a volcano is like anger. Similarly, we prefer to explicate less prototypical entities in terms of more prototypical entities. So in the example given here, Poland and Russia are both countries belonging to the ex-Soviet bloc. However, of the two, Russia is more prototypical than Poland. Hence, we're more likely to say that Poland is like Russia than we are to say that Russia is like Poland. Now, so far, I've illustrated metaphor directionality with reference to English. However, there's massive evidence showing that metaphor directionality is a cognitive universal. You find it all over the world. In fact, in our Max Planck Jakarta field station, a colleague of ours, Tessa Yudita, did a couple of studies which showed that metaphor directionality works the same way in Indonesian as it does in English. This was one study that she did. Another one was specific to metaphors and emotions. Now, of course, there are differences between different languages. So Indonesians prefer to think of emotions as residing in the liver, whereas English speakers prefer the heart as the seat of emotions. However, in both cases, emotions are connected metaphorically to a particular organ, once again, something concrete, explicating something that is abstract. And in this article, we both discuss some of these similarities that emerge from an experimental study of synesthetic metaphors in Indonesian and in English. So metaphor directionality is universal, but although conceptual hierarchies are the same across cultures, they're still expressed in languages of different structures, which raises the question whether these different structures have an effect on the ways in which the conceptual hierarchies are manifest. And in this paper, we're going to argue that, in fact, they do. So let's now return to the complexity covariance hypothesis. As our point of departure, we'll take the observation that from a mathematical point of view, directionality is more complex than the absence of directionality. So in general, asymmetry is more complex than symmetry. Asymmetry involves taking a symmetric structure and adding something to one of the two terms in order to make it stronger, dominant, or in other words, introducing asymmetry. This leads to a prediction, namely that directionality of metaphors will co-vary with polity complexity. Or to put it differently, big languages or languages associated with more complex polities will have greater metaphor directionality than smaller languages or languages associated with simpler levels of polity complexity. In order to show this, we will adapt the context experiment, which was first developed and introduced by my co-author Yeshayahu Shen in collaboration with his colleague Roy Porat. What this experiment does is to pit grammar, which may vary across languages, against conceptual hierarchies which are presumably universal. The context experiment presents subjects with a metaphor. In this case, a daffodil is like a bus driver, and two potential speakers who might utter the metaphor. The two potential speakers are associated respectively with the first and second terms in the metaphor. So in the case at hand, the florist is associated with the daffodil, the passenger is associated with the bus driver. Subject's task is to answer the simple question, which of the two potential speakers is more likely to utter the metaphor in question. Now, if you're puzzling over the metaphor, a daffodil is like a bus driver, that's fine, you're supposed to. The metaphors were purposefully chosen to be novel or nonsensical. We don't have any idea what it means for a daffodil to be like a bus driver, and subjects aren't supposed to have any idea either. That's precisely the point. The metaphor is supposed to be novel in order to ensure that there is no untoward influence from the speaker's level of education, from various culture-specific properties. We want to abstract away from levels of education and culture in order to get at the underlying cognitive processes that are at play here. In addition, the metaphor is given in the non-canonical order. So in accordance with the animacy hierarchy, it would actually have been preferred to say that the bus driver, who is human, is like the daffodil, which is a plant, rather than the way that is presented here. And this is on purpose, because this enables us to pit grammar against conceptual hierarchies. So, there are two possible choices. If the subject chooses the florist, then basically grammar is winning out over the conceptual hierarchy. Whereas if the subject chooses the passenger, it's the animacy hierarchy that wins. So basically what this experiment does is enable us to measure the contribution of grammar to metaphor directionality. And of course, the more highly structured the grammar is, the greater the contribution to metaphor directionality we expect to find. Now this example pertained to the animacy hierarchy, but we also have analogous stimuli in the experiment pertaining to the abstractness hierarchy and to the prototypicality hierarchy. The experiment consisted of 16 comparisons, all in the non-canonical order, 6 violating the animacy hierarchy, 6 violating the concreteness hierarchy, and 4 violating the prototypicality hierarchy. Our prediction was that the higher the socio-political complexity, the more likely grammar is to override conceptual hierarchies. Here are the results from the 10 languages that we have examined so far, and the APLL languages are indicated here in red. The percentages basically indicate the number of canonical responses, that is to say, those in which the grammar won out over the conceptual hierarchies. That is to say, these percentages provide an indication of the degree to which grammar contributes to reinforcing the directionality of metaphors in the respective languages. The languages here are ranged in order of increasing metaphor directionality, from Abui, which is the lowest at 47.1%, to English and Hebrew, which are the highest at around 80%. This table represents the same results. The vertical axis represents metaphor directionality, that is to say the scores of the experiment, while the horizontal axis represents the polity complexity associated with each of the 10 languages in the experimental sample, ranging from low to the left to high on the right. And as you can see from the trend line, which is supported by statistical analysis, there is a positive correlation between polity complexity and metaphor directionality, so our prediction was borne out. Greater directionality in metaphors does co-vary with greater polity complexity. Here we see the 4 APLL languages in the sample, and as you can see, there's a certain amount of scatter around the trend line. However, we still see that the trend is upheld, most noticeably by the contrast between Abui and the 3 Malay languages, but also within the Malay languages by the contrast between Minangkabau on the one hand and Jakarta and Standard Indonesian on the other. So to summarize, our prediction was borne out. However, there's a bit of a puzzle regarding Standard and Jakarta Indonesian, for which we had a prediction, namely that Standard would be more highly directional than Jakarta Indonesian, which was not borne out. The two are roughly of equal degrees of directionality. So far, the results that we presented were from speakers of medium to high socioeconomic status. However, just as grammatical complexity correlates with sociopolitical complexity, it also co-varies with socioeconomic status. So to check to see whether we would find a similar effect with regard to metaphor directionality, we ran the Minangkabau experiment on a different sample of speakers. What we did was to go to the beach, where most people there are of mid to lower socioeconomic status, the bottom of the pyramid, as it were. And indeed, we found a statistically significant, in fact, quite a remarkable difference in the scores, namely that the people on the beach had less metaphor directionality than the more upper-class people sitting at home with their smartphones or their computers. So we actually find further confirmation for the socio-political factors internal to Minangkabau by comparing higher to lower socioeconomic status. In conclusion then, what we've seen in this paper is that metaphor comprehension is sensitive to socio-political factors. Greater socio-political complexity, reflected in polity complexity and higher SES, is conducive to greater propensity for grammar to override conceptual hierarchies. Metaphor directionality thus confirms the complexity covariance hypothesis. More generally, we conclude from this study that sociopolitical factors affect language and thought. Linguistics has a built-in methodological bias in favor of the languages of complex polities and of high SES speakers, with their associated grammatical features. We argue that typology must balance its samples not only geographically, genealogically, and structurally, but also socio-politically. And our favorite APLL languages, in fact, provide a wonderful laboratory for the investigation of socio-political variation. Thank you.